Dirlisum Oliveira Paiva was a happy little boy. He was 10 years old and lived with his family in Brazil. In January 2022, he and his family moved to the rural area of Brasil Novo in the north of the country. The community was near the Amazon River and surrounded by lush green jungle. It was a beautiful but dangerous place to live, especially for an adventurous 10-year-old boy. On July 27, 2022, young Dirlisum grabbed his fishing rod and told his father that he was heading out to catch fish at a nearby pond. It was somewhere the two of them had been many times before, but that was the last time his father saw him alive. The young boy wandered off through the trees towards a clearing. When the trees opened up, sunlight penetrated the canopy, illuminating a large pond in the middle. Dirlisum and his father had fished there recently. He cast his rod into the water and sat on the bank, waiting for a bite. Tragically, one was about to come, but not the kind of bite the young boy was hoping for. A predator was less than a mile away in the heart of the jungle. It raised its head and sniffed the air. It was on the hunt. A waft from the youngster drifted on the gentle breeze. The smell enticed the creature to investigate. It was large and jet black, one of only 600 in the entire world. It was a black panther, a melanistic color variant of the jaguar. Black panthers are incredibly rare, but they are just as lethal as their sandy-browned counterparts. They are obligate carnivores, surviving purely on meat alone. They are expert hunters, walking through the dense jungle habitat, listening, watching, and waiting for any sign of potential prey. Once detected, they will home in on it, silently moving closer until within striking distance. In the Brazilian Amazon, there are thought to be around 79,000 regular jaguars. They typically feed on capybara and giant anteaters, but they also prey on marsh deer, peccaries, turtles, and caiman. They are excellent swimmers and even hunt and catch fish underwater. In some areas, they are active primarily during twilight and at nighttime, but in the dense Amazon rainforest, they prefer to hunt during the day. That's what this one was doing when Dirlisum headed to the pond that day. Only the sound of Dirlisum's reel occasionally clicking as he reeled in his line competed with the birds singing in the trees. Not even the birds were aware of the potential danger moving ever closer. The boy's parents remained back at the house with his younger sibling, none of them alert to the danger the 10-year-old was in. All were blissfully unaware. Through the trees, the jaguar finally spotted the boy. It had followed his scent, pricking its ears to listen to the sounds of the wild before stepping closer. It could see that the boy was transfixed on the pond in front of him. It moved around to the back of him, concealing its approach. It moved to his blind spot, something characteristic of the large feline. In the shadows of the forest, the black jaguar was camouflaged. Only its lighter-colored eyes could be seen peering out from its black face. They locked onto Dirlisum. It placed each paw carefully and silently on the soft, muddy ground, the paw prints leaving a trace of its presence, giving away the culprit of the imminent attack. Just feet from the edge of the pond, the jaguar was ready to pounce. If Dirlisum had looked behind him now, he would have stared right into the eyes of one of South America's most powerful predators. But he didn't hear a sound. Then it struck. It sprung forward. It latched its powerful jaws around the young boy's head, clamping down with its long, sharp canine teeth. Not going for the neck like other large cats, the jaguar will instead use its incredible bite force, exceeding 1,500 psi, to crush its prey's skull. Dirlisum tried to put up a fight. He couldn't see what was attacking him from behind. He felt the full force of the jaws around his head and thrashed his arms around, trying to hit it off him. He had been knocked forwards under the weight of the large animal and was lying face down in the dirt. He kicked his legs, but he couldn't fight the predator off him. His screams and cries for help went unanswered, the terrifying sounds absorbed by the jungle surrounding him. It was only seconds before the jaguar delivered its fatal bone-crushing blow. Dirlisum lay still. The jaguar began to drag the body away. It clamps its teeth onto the boy's cheeks, tearing his skin and disfiguring his face. But then it heard something and stopped. Not far away came a noise, the sound of people coming closer. The jaguar dropped the boy and ran off into the undergrowth, leaving its prey behind. Dirlissam's father had been wondering where he had got to. He was supposed to be home by now, but hadn't shown up. He ventured into the jungle along with some neighbors, calling out his son's name. There was no reply. All was quiet. They followed the trail that had been beaten through the undergrowth from the village to the pond. It twisted and wound around the trees. They stepped over tree roots and ducked under branches. Then they came to the clearing. There was no sign of Dirlissam anywhere. They called out his name again. No reply. Then they spotted his fishing gear on the side of the bank. As they walked up to it, they could see some fresh blood on the ground. It was dark red, spattered on the leaves and pooling on the soft mud. As they inspected the site, they found some torn clothing. This was very bad news. Suddenly, their adrenaline began kicking in as they realized that something terrible had happened to the friendly, forever smiling little boy. As they worked their way around the water's edge, they came across more clues. Some torn clothing was left strewn about. Then his father spotted something that made his blood freeze. Some enormous paw prints in the soft mud. They were certainly the footprints of a jaguar. Suddenly, the group looked around nervously. Dirlissam's father called out to his son once more, shouting his name into the surrounding trees. His voice was trembling slightly. His heart was thundering in his chest. Were they still being watched by the predator that likely took his son? Was it still out there? Was there any chance that Dirlissam was still alive? They came across some drag marks. A body had been pulled along the side of the lake and into the jungle. The undergrowth had been flattened, the soil disturbed. They followed the trail. Then, just 50 more yards ahead, they spotted Dirlissam. His body was lying still in the undergrowth. His father ran up to him crying out to his boy. When he reached him, he knelt down and cradled him in his arms and wept. Dirlissam was dead. His face was mutilated from the attack. His skull had been crushed. The jaguar had disappeared. Enraged by the attack, the villagers came together. Those that didn't stay to comfort the family set off into the jungle to hunt down the jaguar. They tracked it using the characteristic paw prints left behind. When they killed it, they laid out its body on the ground and inspected it. Its jet black fur glistened in the sunshine. Its paws, 4 inches, 10 centimeters across. There were reports that it was sporting a deep gash in the side of its neck. Had Dirlissam put up an incredible fight using his fishing knife to try and fight off the jaguar? It appeared so, but no one will ever know for sure. Following the attack, locals spoke of the number of jaguars they had seen around the pond before. It was a place known to be popular with the large cats. Would Dirlissam's father have allowed him to go fishing there alone had he known this beforehand? The 10-year-old boy was known to be an incredibly happy child. The locals remembered him to be always smiling and having a good time. His death shook the local community and sent a warning to others who ventured beyond the village. Living in the rurals on the edge of the Amazon certainly had its perks, but it was also a deadly place where locals would sometimes meet their terrifying final affliction. Before the Second World War, humans had been slowly whittling down the populations of animals living in the U.S., fueled by illegal hunting and under-the-table fur trades. Even the populous alligators in the Everglades were nearly wiped out, and sightings of the mighty buffalo were becoming so rare that you might as well have been out looking for a unicorn. But the end of the Second World War brought an end to most of the senseless killing, both of humans and of animals. New laws and better policing of the national parks gave the animals who called the wilderness home a chance to recover. Now there are more alligators, buffaloes, deer, elk, wolves, and mountain lions than ever. Only the wolves and buffaloes are still playing catch-up, but the rest of the endangered species are no longer at risk at all. It truly is remarkable what we've accomplished in these past years. Rocky Mountain National Park is one of these protected places. It's teeming with wildlife, and people come from all over the country to see them. But with rising populations also comes greater risk, especially when people continue to move deeper and deeper into the wildest areas where predators roam free. In July 1997, a female mountain lion was out on the prowl. By now, she was an experienced hunter and often took down heavy game like deer. But her progressing pregnancy was starting to make movement difficult for her. The big game was no longer an option. Even the old bucks and small calves that were usually easy pickings were always surrounded by younger and stronger deer with heavy hooves. With her limited mobility, those hooves could be the death of her, or at the very least, the death of her cubs before they were even born. She needed a few decent kills to sustain her for the first few weeks after she gave birth. She wouldn't be able to leave the den that she'd already prepared for her upcoming litter during that time. Whatever she could kill in the next few days had to be enough to give her sufficient strength to give birth to her cubs and also to be able to produce milk for them. She'd spent the last week attentively observing her surroundings, formulating a new plan of action. It needed something bigger than the small game that had been supplementing her, but not too big to pose too much danger. The mountain goats were still too big, and they came with murderous horns, but the rodents and hares weren't big enough to offer much sustenance. And then there were the humans that frequented the mountain lion's home. They were loud, and sometimes they carried metal sticks that made more noise than the cat had ever even heard before. Those strange sticks could bring down a deer with a single blast. The humans seemed like a good upgrade from rodents, but they were rarely out on their own, always surrounded by other human companions. Still, the smaller ones were a very good option to go for, but only if she could catch one as it wandered away from its pack. When it fell asleep the night before, the cat was mulling the details over in her mind, and by the time it woke the next morning, she had formulated a plan. And right as it predicted, like every morning, the small groups of humans came into the wilderness at the crack of dawn. Small families, large groups of friends, and pairs of lovers drifted into the wilderness at the early hours of the morning. Most of them walked the trails to Cascade Falls. The waterfall was the main attraction of that part of the park, and it was so well traveled that animals big and small avoided drinking water there at all. Instead, they preferred to go downstream a few miles to avoid the people altogether. The cat watched several groups go by, waiting until a band of humans came in that had smaller ones with them. It honed in on a group of 5 and followed them into the trees. She stayed far behind them, watching to see if it could get lucky enough for one to finally break free from the rest. The group had 3 adults and 2 children in it. The mountain lion was keeping an eye on the 2 smaller ones. The Miedema family was completely unaware of the fact that they were being followed the moment that they stepped foot in the forest. Kathy and David brought their 2 children, 6-year-old Rose and 10-year-old Mark, for a day out in the woods. With them was a friend and colleague of Kathy's. Kathy was a registered nurse, and her friend Dina was the receptionist at the hospital where they worked. Chatting and strolling leisurely along, the group stopped frequently for snacks and bathroom breaks. Mark had a bag of peanuts to nibble on as he walked, but he didn't eat any of it. Instead, he dropped them on the ground, one by one, making a little trail for them to follow when they turned back. His imagination ran wild as he laid down the trail of peanuts. His thoughts were full of Hansel and Gretel and their breadcrumbs, pirates following the dotted lines on their treasure map. He was creating his own little adventure with only peanuts and the power of his child mind. This imaginary world was a lot more fun than listening to his mother and Dina complain about work anyway. About 3/4 of the way to the falls, Mark's peanuts ran out, but he looked back at the line of nuts behind them with satisfaction. If the birds and squirrels didn't notice it, then they'd find his perfect dotted line on their way back, like a real treasure map, with the car in the parking lot being their treasure. Meanwhile, from the shadows, the cat was still watching. Every time Rosie or Mark stepped into the bushes to relieve themselves, the feline in the shadows inched forward. But every time, just as she thought that the children were in her grasp, Kathy or David stepped forward to keep them in their sights. For the first half of the trail, all the way to the falls, The female targeted only Rosie. She was the smallest of them all, and surely the tiny child would be the easiest one to bring down. But the little one spent her time on her father's back or holding her mother's hand, practically attached to her parents' hips. The predator was properly tired by the time the 5 of them reached the falls. It had been hours of stalking, just to be interrupted by one of the adults every time. But she'd at least remain hidden in the brush, staying just far enough to remain out of sight. The Midemas and Dina still had no inkling that they were being actively hunted in broad daylight. At the falls, the animal moved in closer, her movements masked by the running and crashing of the waterfall. She was so low to the ground that her swollen belly skimmed the forest floor. She knew that the day had already dragged on so long that if she gave up her stock, she probably wouldn't eat at all. So she stayed on, for now, just watching them. She was so desperate that she was even willing to try for one of the adults, as long as at least one of them wandered away on their own. That's when the other smaller one caught her eye, drawing her attention away from Rosie. The boy was bigger, sure, but he seemed the most likely to find his way out of his parents' reach. Mark was darting about with endless energy. At first, he splashed his feet in the water. Then he ran and climbed on a fallen log. After that, he and his father chased each other over the rocks. And finally, he made one more trip to the waterline, picking up small stones to throw into the stream. He was a lively, happy, and active child, like almost every other boy his age. Mark's bubbly personality even brought out a little more adventure in his sister Rosie, who was much more reserved and shy. If anyone was going to explore on his own, it would be Mark. He was the cat's next target. After a quick bite to eat and a long drink of water, the group started heading back down the trail. Mark kept his eyes on the ground for the first hour or two, trying to spy on a peanut. He started to think that the rodents had found his trail after all, and his little heart sank with disappointment. But not for long. Just when he'd given up hope, he saw the near-perfect line of treats start up where his bag had run empty. With an exciting whoop, he ran forward, intending to follow the peanuts all the way to the car. David smiled. He'd been aware of what his son had been doing with his bag of snacks, and instead of telling Mark off for wasting food, he allowed him to have his fun. That's what the woods were about, after all, making your own adventures. So he let Mark run ahead, knowing he'd stay on the trail where the peanuts were. The lion that had been sneaking behind them quickened her pace when the boy raced away from his parents. Just ahead of the trail, there was a bend that would obscure him from the 3 adults. If she got there quick enough, she could cut him off and have him out of there before the others even caught up to Mark. Silent and quick, she used the rocks and fallen branches to avoid stepping on noisy, dry leaves. She sprinted past Mark, so close that if he raised his eyes from his line of peanuts, he'd have seen her. But he was utterly focused and didn't catch the brown blur that passed by ahead of him. As Mark ran further away from his parents, David called for him to slow down and wait for them. But Mark wasn't listening. When his son disappeared past the curve in the path ahead, David sighed and jogged forward, leaving his wife, daughter, and Dina behind to catch up with Mark. By the time Mark turned the bend, the feline was already in position, and David was still many yards behind them. Crouched behind some bushes, she heard the thump of the bigger man's steps as he jogged closer. She'd spent the whole day being patient. This was her best and probably her only chance to get at the child. If she didn't act now, she'd be hungry for another day. Then Mark ran by, his head still down, looking for more peanuts. The predator leapt at him. The weight of her belly barely slowed her down when she was airborne, thanks to the incredibly muscular legs that propelled her up and forward. Mark saw the movement and jerked his head up. With claws already extended and her body arching through the air, the mountain lion fell on him. The 88-pound cat crushed him into the gravel path. Mark opened his mouth to scream out, but the cat already had its teeth around his throat, closing his airway and blocking any air from passing over his voice box. Her claws enveloped him, digging trenches into his back. Piercing pain ran through Mark's skinny frame. His neck and back felt like they were on fire. If he could have gotten a sound out, he would have been screaming in agony and terror. The mountain lion increased her grip on his windpipe, and Mark heard the snap of his neck reverberate inside his head before his vision switched off and he suddenly went limp. The mountain lion knew instantly that the child was dead. His muscles went completely placid beneath her when she felt the crack of his neck between her jaws. From behind the bend, the sound of sneakers hitting the path was almost upon her, so she released her hold on Mark and grabbed him by his dark hair instead. She dragged his body off the path and into the bushes that she'd just leapt out of. But before she could get the boy out of sight, the father came around the corner. His sneakers came to a sudden halt when he saw his only son being dragged across the trail by the huge predator. She met his eyes, and her gaze brought David out of his shock. With a scream of terror and sorrow, David stormed at the lion. Thoughts of his own safety didn't even register with him. Only the life of his son mattered now, no matter what the monster was that had Mark in its claws. The cat did not expect the man to reach them so soon, and she certainly didn't expect him to make the noise that escaped his mouth. The next moment he rushed at her, startling her enough to make her let go of Mark's scalp, taking a patch of skin and brown hair with her as she turned her clumsy body around and fled into the trees. David's screams alarmed Kathy and Dina, and they ran down the path, leaving their conversation hanging in midair. Rosie was riding on her mother's hip, and she held on for dear life when her mother suddenly sprinted forward. Kathy found David crouched beside the terrible sight of her young son lying bleeding on the ground. And even with all of her medical background as a nurse, she knew that the severe angle of his neck meant that it was too late. She still ran forward, shoving Rosie into Dina's arms. Kathy ripped David's shirt right off his back and wrapped it around Mark's torn-open neck, but the blood no longer flowed with the steady pump of a heartbeat. It just seeped out steadily. While Kathy attempted CPR and applied pressure to her boy's neck, Dina was already running ahead with Rosie bouncing on her hip. She found a group of mountain bikers less than a mile ahead, and they rode in to get some help. But by the time Dina returned, Kathy and David were sitting numb with horror, no longer struggling to bring Mark back. They eventually realized that there was nothing they could do for Mark, with a broken neck and the gashes on his throat. Both wounds were fatal on their own, and he was starting to lose his body heat and develop that unmistakable gray tinge to his skin that came with death. For the next hour, they sat waiting for help to arrive. Dina held Rosie's head in her hair to spare the child the sight of her dead big brother. The bikers had managed to find 2 park rangers, and they rode their off-road Jeep to the scene. One of them stayed behind while the other escorted Kathy, David, Dina, and Rosie back to the lot to await emergency services that were already on their way. The man who stayed behind took off his jacket and placed it over Mark's remains. He couldn't handle looking at the child's blank eyes and the raw wound on his neck a second longer. Mark's body was removed from the scene, and searchers went out to look for the mountain lion. It took a professional tracker 3 days to find her. The cat was killed with 2 bullets and taken in for an autopsy, though no one expected any of Mark's remains to be in her system, given that she'd only managed to tear away a small piece of his scalp. But they did find the 2 cubs inside her belly, probably only days away from being born. But with the child's killer dead, the family could begin to heal after their only son, Mark Medena, met his terrifying final affliction. A wolf-dog hybrid is the offspring of a wolf and a dog, bred either intentionally or by mistake, but their temperament can be challenging. Not fully wild and not fully domestic, wolf hybrids can be unpredictable, difficult to train, and aggressive. They are probably not the best family pets to keep, especially when your family includes a 3-month-old baby. About 20 miles from Birmingham, Alabama, lies Chelsea. It is considered the fastest-growing city in Shelby County and is home to 15,000 people. The town's motto is, "All about family," and the town certainly seems to cater to families. There are hiking trails to explore across 750 acres at Double Oak Park, and plenty of restaurants and eateries. But on November 30th, 2023, For one family that called Chelsea home, their lives were about to be turned upside down. Unknown to authorities, because notification isn't a legal requirement, the family kept a dangerous pet, a wolf hybrid. These are the offspring of domestic dogs that have bred with wolves. Their appearance is very wolf-like. They have a more wild nature and natural way about them. They look incredible and strong. Owning one makes for a stunning addition to the family, but they do not make good pets. Domestic dogs have been bred to rely on humans over thousands of years. Their behavior is molded to our needs, and training them is relatively easy as a result. They are obedient and docile. They are often affectionate and protective. In comparison, wolves are not adapted to living with humans. They are independent animals that can be difficult to train and certainly difficult to predict. Although they may look like a fearsome wolf, wolves by nature tend to be shy animals, and so wolf hybrids don't make good guard dogs, which is one of the reasons people mistakenly buy them. They can be dangerous when humans don't understand their needs and don't provide adequate care. One standout difference between domestic dogs and wolves is their maturation age and social hierarchy. When a wolf reaches maturity, anywhere from 1 to 4 years old, it will begin to assert itself in the pack, trying to climb the ranks and make its presence known. It will fight with other members of the pack and can attack more submissive family members. When a wolf hybrid is taken into the family home, the humans in that home become its pack, and its innate aggression can therefore be directed at people. As a result, they can be very dangerous animals to keep as pets. On November 30th, 2023, in Chelsea, a 3-month-old boy had momentarily been left on the floor of the family home. He was having some tummy time, whilst his parents popped into the kitchen to fetch some food. The baby lay there helplessly. He wriggled his legs, kicking them out behind him. His head bobbed up and down, and he looked up at the wolf-dog hybrid staring at him. He was clearly a helpless individual that posed no threat to the dog, but the wolf dog had other ideas. He stood up from the corner of the room and trotted over to the baby. Suddenly, the parents heard some growling followed by high-pitched crying. They rushed back to the baby to find him covered in blood. Their pet wolf hybrid was standing over him, pawing at him and biting him. The parents claimed that their pet was biting the baby in a playful manner, but the damage that the biting and clawing caused to such a young infant was devastating. Initial reports suggested that the parents found it difficult to get the wolf hybrid off their baby, as the pet was unresponsive to their commands. It didn't shy away from them when they shouted at it to drop the baby. Instead, it continued to attack the infant, shaking it in its jaws like a rag doll. Whether the dog was being playful or not remains to be determined. The family believed the dog was part of the family, that it had never caused any concerns before. But experts know how unpredictable wolf hybrids can be. Their behavior can switch in an instant. Perhaps the dog was simply asserting its dominance. It had seen the baby as a threat or as a member of the pack that needed to be put in its place, and it had taken action. The baby was a new addition to the family, something the wolf hybrid would have to get used to. Perhaps the family overlooked the impact a new baby would have on their dog. The vulnerability of the baby meant that the bite from such a large and powerful dog was serious. Even if it was just nipping in a playful manner, the damage the teeth made were devastating. The force from the bite could deliver a powerful blow, and the baby was certainly no match for the animal. When the dog finally released the 3-month-old, the parents rushed over to him, and his mother scooped him up in her arms. He was in bad shape. It was a terrible thing for his parents to have witnessed, and now they prayed that he pulled through. They made a desperate call to the emergency services, and they were dispatched to the location. Deputies, firefighters, and animal control officers rushed to the scene straight away and arrived shortly before 1 p.m. When they got there, the little boy was still alive, and he was rushed to Grandview Medical Center in an ambulance. The paramedics knew that it was a race against time, and so the ambulance was provided with a law enforcement escort. But tragically, despite the best efforts of the medical team, the little boy didn't make it. The bite from the family pet had proved too much, and he succumbed to his injuries, leaving behind a distraught family and a shocked community. Other children were also in the home at the time, but no one else was hurt. It was a devastating thing for the family to witness, and something that will likely haunt them forever. A simple mistake, and naively believing that their beloved pet could be trusted with an infant, had cost them their son's life. The house was surrounded by trees, an idyllic place for a child to grow up. The community spirit was strong in Chelsea, and the town had a rural feel. Residents looked out for each other, and it was the kind of town where you would bump into people you knew all the time. It is considered one of the best places to live in Alabama. So, when tragedy struck the young family that fateful Thursday afternoon, the shockwaves were felt throughout the town. The town mayor offered thoughts and prayers for the family as they mourned their loss. At the time of making this video, few details have emerged of the horrific incident. It is not known how long the family had the dog for and where it had come from. There were no reports of it causing problems before, and nothing indicating why the parents left the baby on its own with the dog. A veterinarian was called to the premises, and the animal was put down at the house. The dog was sent to the Alabama State Diagnostics Laboratory in Auburn for further testing. Its genetics were known, and they confirmed that it did have wolf blood in it. Chelsea Mayor Tony Picklesimmer said that if people own an exotic pet, then they need to consider the additional responsibilities that requires not only to keep your family safe, but also your neighbors. An investigation into the infant's death is being conducted and a post-mortem carried out. In other parts of the world, certain breeds of dog are banned. In the UK, for example, the Pit Bull Terrier, Japanese Tosa, Dogo Argentino are banned and cannot be kept by anyone living there. Perhaps the wolf dog hybrids should be a banned breed, given their dangerous tendencies and the difficulty in training them. Hybrid wolves are considered exotic pets, whilst most states either ban all exotic pets altogether or allow some to be kept under strict laws and licensing. Alabama is one of just 4 states that has no code against exotic pets. Maybe a change in the law is necessary to keep people safe. The International Wolf Center explained that thousands of pet wolves or hybrids are abandoned or rehomed every year because people are unable to look after them. Owners are unaware of their wild nature and unpredictability. They require significant mental stimulation, otherwise they can develop destructive and sometimes aggressive behaviors. This was a truly tragic incident that could have been avoided if hybrid pet owners were made aware of the dangers of keeping a semi-wild predator under their roofs. Unfortunately, this won't be the last wolf hybrid attack on pet owners as long as the laws allow these animals to be pets. Their unpredictable and wild nature will almost certainly lead to another innocent person's terrifying final affliction.